From the New York Institute for the Humanities, I'm Melanie Rehak. At a moment when media coverage of books and the arts in general has diminished dramatically, what does it mean to be a critic? And in particular, what does it mean to be a woman critic at a time when women are making their voices heard in powerful new ways, even as the platforms for publishing criticism are disappearing? My guest today, Ruth Franklin, is not only a book critic herself, but has written and spoken extensively on the subject of, as she's put it, why the literary landscape continues to disadvantage women. She's also former editor at The New Republic and the author of Shirley Jackson, A Rather Haunted Life, published in 2016, which won the National Book Critics Circle Award for Biography and was named a New York Times Notable Book of 2016 and a Best Book of 2016 by the Boston Globe, NPR, and others. She's the recipient of a Guggenheim Fellow in Biography, a Cullman Fellowship at the New York Public Library, a Leon Levy Fellowship in Biography, and perhaps most relevant to our conversation today, the Roger Shattuck Prize for Criticism. So, Ruth, I'm going to first, as I promised, quote you back to yourself and let our listeners know that in your acceptance speech at the awards ceremony for the Roger Shattuck Prize for Criticism, you said that we are living in a time in which criticism is suffering from a demotion in prestige. So I want to talk about that, but before we jump fully into that huge topic, can you just sort of give us a baseline definition? What is criticism? What should it be? And why do we need it?
So what is criticism? When you quote that line back to me, I think maybe I was a little bit harsh. And it was a few years ago when I wrote that, and things have been changing at a very rapid pace. So first of all, when I think of criticism on the most basic level, it's being able to bring to people's attention works of art that are new or exciting or that speak to our shared sense of existence in some meaningful way. And the critic's responsibility, maybe now more than ever, although that seems to be a phrase that gets tossed around now more than ever, the critic's responsibility is to, not only seek out what everybody already knows they're interested in hearing about and interpreting that for an audience, but also to look for what people haven't heard of, the book that nobody's talking about because it's obscure or because the author doesn't have a good publicist. And we can get into, all the ways in which books and films and other types of art are, disseminated into the marketplace in ways that, don't always correlate with their quality or their level of interest. But yeah, on a basic level, I'd say, criticism is about raising awareness of art.
And why do you think we need that? I mean, I obviously have my own ideas and could make an argument, but what is it, you touched on it a little bit when you talk about our shared sensibility. What is it that makes criticism a sort of necessary feature, especially in modern life?
So in some ways, we're surrounded by criticism, right? You go on Amazon and look up a book, and you don't even have to ask for it. It spits up at you, the five-star reviews and the 3 2-star reviews. And you can click the button to say this review was helpful or not, offering your own little meta-criticism of the criticism. So in some way, you might well make the argument, we don't need quote-unquote professional critics because everybody's a critic. And of course, it's not just Amazon. One reason I said before that, I thought my line about demotion of prestige, thinking about it now, maybe, 4 or 5 years later, seems a little bit harsh, is that there's a wider sphere for criticism, I think, than there's ever been before. We all know that there's been kind of a demise of the regular Sunday book review section, which, once upon a time, there were several newspapers in New York that had them and also standalone sections all over the country. And then gradually, many of them have closed down. And as a critic who's been working now for almost 20 years, I've had the misfortune of seeing many of the outlets I once wrote for close down. The Washington Post Book World, which is where I wrote my very first ever freelance book review, hasn't been a standalone section for years, and naturally, I could go on. I recently heard that even a paper like the Philadelphia Inquirer no longer has a budget for book reviews, meaning that they literally don't pay reviewers. And we could talk about all the reasons that economic factors have contributed to a decline in reviewing. But I think it's just as important to point out that there has been a burst of new kinds of criticism that we didn't have, as recently as 10 years ago. Most of all, TV criticism, which is totally flourishing mainly on the web, on sites like Vulture, many other ones where you see, this really robust dialogue between people. And again, it's not just one critic pontificating from on high, but it really is a discussion where people, will watch the shows and then will go online and read the recaps and have a discussion in the comments section about it. And I think, there's a lot of nostalgia for this, what we think of as, kind of the 1950s era of criticism, partisan review and Mary McCarthy and, Alfred Kazin and whoever the giants of our past were. And on the one hand, it's a misplaced nostalgia because this was a type of criticism that was only open to the elites and basically just for white men. And the kinds of works that were getting discussed befitted that audience. At the same time, I think what we have now is kind of a flourishing of the critical dialogue that's so important in order for us to have a healthy and robust art scene in America. Because to answer, again, your question of what criticism is for, it's not just for the audience, it's also for the artists. I think having critics out there who are challenging, who are trying to push writers and filmmakers to a higher level in their own work is important.
So you mentioned Mary McCarthy, which gets me really neatly to my next question, which is about women critics, both in the present moment and historically. In the piece that you wrote that I mentioned in the opener to our conversation called Why the Literary Landscape Continues to Disadvantage Women, you trace a really clear and really pretty depressing path back from the present day through the work and commentary of people in the generation before us, like Francine Prose and Meg Wolitzer, and then I would put Mary McCarthy sort of one generation behind them, and then all the way back to Virginia Woolf. And it's plain, obviously, that women have never had an equal voice in the world of criticism, and that has really affected the books that come to us both as popular readers and become enshrined in the literary canon. And I want to read this Virginia Woolf quote that you included because it's such a great summation of the way men have decided the literary agenda for so long. And she writes, "This is an important book, the critic assumes, because it deals with war. This is an insignificant book because it deals with the feelings of women in a drawing room. A scene in a battlefield is more important than a scene in a shop. Everywhere, and much more subtly, the difference of value persists." So I wonder if you could just talk a little about the history of women critics and basically how we've all read for our entire lives.
Yeah, I think that quote from Virginia Woolf really just sums it all up. And it's so illuminating when you hear it spelled out so plainly like that. Because when you look back at literary history, just the books that you know and you've always loved, it's clear that the subjects that men write about are considered important simply because men write about them. And the subjects that women write about are simply considered less important. And I wrote that piece, I think, in response to a count that was done by a group called VITA that supports visibility for women in the literary world and now also people of color. And they literally had done a byline count of most of the major literary journals or the journals publishing book reviews, counting both the numbers of male versus female book reviewers and the male versus female breakdown in the authors who were reviewed. And not surprisingly, the breakdowns were similar. More books by men were getting reviewed, and more male critics were reviewing books than female critics. And in the years since Vita has been publishing with a lot of publicity and fanfare this count, things have actually changed. And it's been inspirational to see. The New York Times is one of the magazines that I think has really taken their Vita numbers to heart. Shortly after Vita started publishing them, the Times Book Review hired a female book review editor, Pamela Paul, who I think has really made it her mission to achieve parity in the pages of the book review. And I see a big difference there. There are other publications, like the New York Review of Books, that I think have been a little slower to make changes, but also do seem to be moving in that direction. So we've seen a lot of change in the last 5 years, and it's not just about parity for women, but also about parity for people of color, for whom the situation in publishing and in book reviewing is, in fact, so much worse even than the situation for women. So I feel moderately encouraged about the possibilities for change.
The Virginia Woolf quote reminds me every time I read it of one of my favorite books, which happens to be Life Among the Savages, which happens to be by Shirley Jackson, which truly is, more than most other books I can think of, a book about life in the parlor, life in the kitchen, raising children, marriage, all of those things, and written very much as a comedy. And I think every time I read that Virginia Woolf quote, I think, yes, that's exactly the kind of book that she's talking about, which is such a wonderful book and has provided me many hours of, not only laughter, but solace when I was really having a rotten day in my own household. And your biography of Shirley Jackson did something which I think also feels very relevant and critical to this moment, which is it took a writer who I feel like for years and years was spoken about in literary circles as, oh, yes, she's a great writer. She's a major writer. But no one ever really did anything about that. It was sort of a backroom secret, right? If you were a writer, a real reader, you read Shirley Jackson and you knew that she had written more than just The Lottery, which we all read in 7th grade. But kind of nothing ever happened until you, another woman, came along and wrote this book that really established her as a major literary figure. And I wonder if you could talk a little about taking on that responsibility and how that sort of uncannily has dovetailed with this moment when women are really finding their voices and their places in a new way.
Yeah, well, like you, I'm a big fan of Life Among the Savages, as well as Jackson's more serious literary novels like The Haunting of Hill House and We Have Always Lived in the Castle. The way I came to write the book, I feel, is kind of emblematic of that story, which is I had always loved Shirley Jackson and had her in the back of my mind as one of my touchstone writers. But I hadn't been aware, actually, of the books you brought up, her household memoirs, until relatively recently when the Library of America, again, almost 10 years ago, brought out an anthology of Jackson's writing, and it included some excerpts from those very cheerful household memoirs. And one of them was published under the title The Third Baby's the Easiest, which I guess was its original title when it appeared in one of the women's magazines that Jackson became so popular writing for. And it's this laugh-out-loud account of labor and delivery, which you know as well as I do how hard that must be to write about. But also there's this moment in the beginning of the piece where she checks into the hospital to deliver her third child, and the clerk asks her to put down her occupation. And she says, writer. And this, when her third child was born, by the way, this was just a couple months after Jackson published The Lottery, which was the most sensational story in the history of The New Yorker, generated more letters than they had ever received about a piece of fiction, and is still one of the most popular anthologized short stories in American literature, period. So she had every right to say, I'm a writer. And the clerk said, I'll just put down housewife. And reading this story, I felt like in some ways this told me everything. It both told me everything I needed to know about Shirley Jackson and made me want to find out everything I could about the person behind this little exchange, because that just summed up for me how hard it must have been to be a woman like Jackson, a creative artist with, such an independent, iconoclastic spirit in America in the 1940s and 50s, when all she was supposed to be was to be a housewife. If she said she was something else, nobody was going to believe her anyway. And she had basically no support from her husband or other family members to do the kind of writing that she did. And so it really became my mission to, bring her back to life in that way. And as I was researching the book, one thing I noticed, we can talk about the decline in book reviewing, and it certainly is evident if you write a book about somebody who published a lot in the 50s. Well, Jackson's novels were reviewed by, they could have been reviewed by 50 or 60 different newspapers. So there is obviously a huge decline, and, no novelist today gets that kind of reach and coverage. But the critics were almost all men, and I found that they had really systematically misunderstood what Jackson was doing. And to be fair, she's kind of a difficult writer to understand critically. Each of her books is in a totally different genre. She never repeated herself. She addresses a lot of the same themes, but they all have to do, at the base of it, they all have to do with the problems of women, the situation, the circumstances of women's lives, and they all have female protagonists. And I think this was just anathema to male critics of the time who completely dismissed Jackson as, a housewife writer or a horror writer or, whatever other genre they could try to pin her to. When looked at, honestly, with an open mind, she really is a one-of-a-kind writer.
So what do you think? I mean, imagine a world in which there were critics like you or, some of the other great women critics who are writing now. I mean, what do you think could have happened to Shirley Jackson's life and career? It's so striking to me that it wasn't until 2016 when someone like you who, has come along and taken up a role as women critic said, no, I'm bringing this woman back, that anyone paid any attention to her work and her life, as you say, as a sort of woman writer who didn't have the opportunities that we've had. I mean, do you see a different path for her had things been different?
Sure. I mean, it's complicated because there are so many factors that lead to, why people are received the way they are or, the kind of posterity they have. I think part of the reason that Jackson's reputation kind of languished was because she died so young. She died in 1965 at the age of 48, having written only 6 relatively short books. And then her husband was working on promoting her legacy, and he died only 5 years later. And her children weren't, literary professionals who were able to do that, and her books all went out of print. And it took a while for her reputation to rebound from that. So there's just the circumstantial issue too. But sure, I mean, a world in which Shirley Jackson writing about misfit teenage girls might have gotten a similar kind of reaction to a writer like J.D. Salinger, who was her friend and I think nearly her exact contemporary, writing about misfit teenage boys. I mean, we can imagine a whole kind of different literary history. And, I think the important thing basically is that we don't continue making that mistake now, is that, we continue to seek out writers whose viewpoints don't necessarily correspond with what we assume is important about the way the world works, because they might have something to say that will change our minds about that.
I wonder, had we, had a Ruth Franklin or a, whoever else you want to put in our list of contemporary women critics, which men would never have made it past their first novel, right? I mean, I can think of a few that I would have,
indeed.
Like, okay, that was all right. But, I feel like there's a real lack of, as you say, just the perspective on the content of so much of what has been published in the last, maybe 60 to 70 years. And the assumption that because this is another book by writer X, who was a man, and we all loved that last book and everyone said it was great, well, sure, he's going to publish, another 15 novels, even if 10 of them are completely terrible. And there were no voices to say that. So I wonder if you want to pick out, they could all be dead people. You don't have to name anybody living. But, it's very striking to me as so many of those men pass away and we see how they are treated in the press, and you go back and now thanks to the internet we can read all the contemporary reviews of when their books were published, and I can't think of any women for whom that's really happened.
Well, so the writer who I think of who probably would have been lost to history if he had been a woman is Bellow, because his first novel did really badly. It's, kind of obscure and philosophical and hard to read. It's boring, frankly, and it got bad reviews. And I think if Bello had been a woman, nobody would have given him a second chance. I mean, if Bello had been a woman, that book probably would never have been published in the first place. But the idea of a woman bouncing back from an initial failure like that is hard to imagine. And then I believe he had a second failure with his second novel, whose name I don't remember. And of course, I don't want Bello to have disappeared into obscurity. He's a great American writer, even if he is one of the, part of the cohort that Dwight Garner, in his a little appreciation for Ruth, called the last of the great white males. Obviously, I think his books are really valuable, and I'm glad that he persevered and went on to write The Adventures of Augie March and all the other stuff that he did. But it's hard to imagine a woman at the time having, both the family support and the personal fortitude to keep going after two initial failures. And one thing that I found so heartbreaking while I was researching my book, along the lines of who are the women who we might have overlooked, part of the reason we don't know who they are is because they never had the opportunity to write. It took such a combination of, both natural talent, but also perseverance in the face of lack of support that enabled a writer like Shirley Jackson to publish at all. And of course, as we know, part of the reason she was able to keep persevering was because she was dependent on drugs. She was dependent on amphetamines to help her stay up and write long after, all her household chores had been completed. So she received all these letters from women readers who read her stuff in the women's magazines of the day and wrote to her for advice saying, I want to be a writer too. My family gives me plenty of material, but after I finished with the dishes and making the potato salad for the PTA and dealing with my husband, I'm too tired at the end of the day. What advice can you give me? How can I be a writer if I have all these other things to do? And she often wrote back to these women, and she would suggest that, among other things, that they just neglect the housework a little bit, which certainly was also one of her methods. But the less edifying answer is also that she took speed. And I think that also shows you just how hard it was.
And do you think, you've definitely brightened my spirits as far as criticism and women are concerned now, but do you think that is still happening? I mean, I sometimes have a sense, living here in New York in the center of all the literary hubbub, that all over the country are people, and women especially, with a novel that they wrote and it's sitting in a bottom desk drawer somewhere because they don't have access to getting it published, or no one even knows they wrote it. I mean, that feeling still is very real for me, and I just wonder what you think about that, even given the shift in bylines. And certainly we have many more women critics now than we've had, and whether you think about that at all, and what you think the prescription is going forward.
I think if you have a novel in your drawer, this is probably the easiest time ever to get it published. Not because there's not competition. Obviously there is tremendous competition. But number one, publishers want debut novelists. It's a lot harder, frankly, to publish your second novel than your first. But also because there's so many resources out there. If you're, a woman somewhere in the middle of the country who wants to become a writer, you don't have to write to Shirley Jackson for advice. You can go online. There are Facebook groups for writers. There are podcasts with, really nitty-gritty writing advice. You can sign up and take an online course to learn how to write fiction. There are just all kinds of things that you can do to get your work out there today that are just so much easier to find out about than they used to be. So I think, that is a little ray of hope for people who aren't necessarily, connected in the publishing world or in New York or in MFA programs or however we think is the typical way of people to come up in the literary world. There are a lot of other potential paths.
And a lot more women on the other end, the receiving end. to review your book or bring it to other people's attention?
Yeah, I mean, there's tons of women on the receiving end in the publishing world. There are lots and lots of women editors. As we've seen, that doesn't always mean that there's really going to be change in the way those houses are run. Change like that seems to start at the top. But sure, I can guarantee that there are a lot of women critics and readers out there who are looking to support work that doesn't necessarily fall in the conventional line of what has always been considered important.
I'm going to leave it there. Thank you, Ruth. This was totally fascinating.
Thank you, Melanie.
I look forward to talking about it with you more, not on the podcast. This podcast has been brought to you by the New York Institute for the Humanities at NYU in conjunction with the Arthur L. Carter Journalism Institute. Our producers are Annika Kaundinya and Ben Branstein. Our thanks to Uli Baer and, for their technical and design wizardry, Aaron Dowdy and Selena Lakazi. For more information, or if you'd like to subscribe to our podcast, visit our website at nyihumanities.org. That's all one word. Again, that's nyihumanities.org.